And then we have our Boule. So this one has a much harder crust. Smaller. Hello, and I hope you're having a great day. Today I am making sourdough. I make 100% sourdough, so there's no yeast added. I have my starter here. So this particular sourdough actually uses a lot of sourdough starter. There's some recipes and most of them have you use a little bit and you do a slow rise even in the fridge for a day or two. And I do make some sourdough breads like that, but the one that I keep coming back to just for its simplicity and the quickness is one that calls for a large percentage of sourdough starter. And that really just kickstarts and acts almost like a yeast because there's so much sourdough starter, it starts getting to work so much quicker. I do have my recipe here. I started off with one that I had found online and I've modified it significantly since then. So this particular dough is sad. I make this so often and yet I still question my own numbers. All right, so we need 475 grams of water. In baking, it is one area that I highly, highly, highly recommend having a scale. It is just so much easier. You can tweak adding 10 more grams of water or flour versus having to get like a tablespoon out or a teaspoon or whatever it is. It just makes a big difference. This is about a $50 scale, I think, but that's because I use it for many different things. But just for baking, you can easily get one on Amazon or in a store for $10, $15. And I would venture to say that the amount of money that you save in making your own bread compared to buying loaves of bread, you would very quickly pay back on the investment of a scale. And for me, this type of investment actually does make me much more likely to bake, because if I can just get a scale out, quickly measure and get it going versus having to get cups and I don't know how I ended up. Okay, so I did my sourdough starter last night and apparently my 10 o'clock at night math was a little bit off on how many grams I need. I need 385 grams of sourdough starter. So 475 grams of water to 385 grams of sourdough starter. So as I said, a very high ratio of the two. So the other thing that having so much sourdough starter in here is it also increases the hydration level of the dough. And that's why it's important to follow a recipe, especially with sourdough, as it's called out, and then you kind of tweak from there. So normally what you would do is you mix it, let it sit for 15-20 minutes to hydrate, then you do kind of tuck and folds 3 times with 30 minutes in between each of those. That last time, you put it into a nice ball shape in the bowl, cover it, and you let it sit for about 2 hours until it's really grown in size. That's when you then shape it into whatever loaf that you want. Again, let it rise for about an hour and a half, give or take, depending on the temperature in the room, and then you bake it off. So that can all be done the same day. I'll usually do that on a Saturday or Sunday so that as I'm home, I can do those different steps. During weeknights, if I need to make bread, usually what I'll do is I'll do this step as soon as I come home. So at 5, I'll do this step, about 5:20, 5:30. I'll do the first tuck and fold. 6, I'll do the next tuck and fold, and then 6:30, I'll do the last tuck and fold, shape it, and then I put it into the fridge. I cover it, put it in the fridge, then tomorrow afternoon or evening when I get home from work, I put it in the final shape that I'm going to bake it off in. I'll usually then put it in like a 100-degree oven or in a very warm place because it takes longer for that dough to warm up on the inside, or I just give it a much longer time to proof, and then I'll bake it off and then we'll have bread that evening or the next evening. So this first step, again, this step is optional. I do find that it helps the final texture of the dough. And what you're doing is you're putting all of the water and all of the sourdough starter, and then you're doing a portion of the flour. You mix it, you let this go for a couple of hours or even an hour. Then you come in, add the salt and the last bit of flour, and then you start that process that I mentioned earlier. So I prefer and I like to use a combination of, this is rye flour. So in this particular dough, I do 25 grams of rye flour, about 100 grams of whole wheat. Whole wheat's probably the one. I have a huge bag of rye flour, so I actually have a lot to use. Whole wheat's the one that I don't always have, and then I'll just replace it with a little bit more rye and the rest all-purpose. And then here I'm going to put 100 grams of all-purpose. And then the last bit of flour that I put in after about an hour or two of this sitting is I'll just put all-purpose. So it's a predominantly a bread made with all-purpose, but it has a good portion of the whole wheat and the rye. And I do find that gives it a really nice texture. The all-purpose flour, or you can use bread flour, gives it a good texture. The whole wheat and the rye give it good flavor and just a little bit more character. And it also gives the sourdough starter a little bit more to feed on, especially rye. It has a lot of natural yeasts that it can feed on. So that's what it looks like, very like a thick soup or a pudding texture. So I just mix this. I do if you're going to make breads at home. This is a dough whisk. Very highly recommend this. This compared to a spoon, if you were to do this with a spoon, and even like this spoon with a sourdough starter, it takes so much more effort. It just glumps up, stays on here. You have to get your fingers in there and dig it off. Whereas on here, it just drips off so much easier. So I'm actually gonna make 2 doughs, the same dough. I use the same exact dough to make bread loaves. So I have a bread pan. This dough makes 2 nice sized bread loaves. And then I also use the exact same dough to make a boule, which is the round loaf that you bake off in a Dutch oven, and it has a nice crusty, crunchy outer shell. And what's amazing is it's the exact same dough, and the fact that they taste and operate so differently just based on how they're baked, really. So exact same step. Apparently I did my same funny math last night. I'm glad I actually wasn't going to keep this out, but I thought about making some oatmeal cream cookies, like oatmeal cream pie type cookies. And I need sourdough starter for that, so I decided to leave it out, and I'm glad I did because apparently I needed it. All right, so 385, 475. The one that I'm not going to make today, I like to make for certain occasions, which uses almost the exact same dough. The other thing I didn't mention earlier, I do like to break the sourdough starter up into the water before adding flour. I don't know that it helps. I think it does, and I've watched on like some masterclass videos that they recommend doing that. So, oh, the other dough that I make with almost the exact same dough, the only thing that I do is I add about 30 more grams of water, is a focaccia dough. And it's delicious. Again, full sourdough, and then you bake it off in a flat pan with some olive oil sprinkled with salt. And it is really good for sandwiches, especially like savory sandwiches. This dough, actually, because it rises so quickly, this particular one, it works great for peanut butter and jelly, for breakfast sandwiches, dinner, for all. It doesn't have a strong sourdough flavor. This one will probably taste a little bit stronger because I am going to be leaving it in the fridge overnight, so it has an opportunity to develop a little bit more of those yeasts. But in general, if I do it the same day, it tastes really basically like a white, well, an almost white kind of sandwich bread. Okay. And then later, all I'm going to do, and again, I don't know why I always have to check my own, I just don't want to tell you guys the wrong thing. So I've added this all now, and then later all I have to do is add 400 grams of all-purpose flour and 2 teaspoons of salt. I'm going to use this dough whisk again later to mix that in. And the amazing thing with this dough is it doesn't require kneading. I've been making sourdough bread for about 10 years now, and I've done tons, and actually before that, even non-sourdough, like with yeast and all these different high hydration, all these different types of doughs. And the fact that this dough does not require kneading, and actually I've made it with a machine where I've kneaded it, and it turned out worse than when I've just made it like this. And that's just amazing, and to me makes it so much more attainable, especially in a busy life where I have husband, kids, work, hobbies, things that I want to be doing other than laboring in the kitchen all day. So, all right, I will check back in a couple hours when I'm ready to do the next step. So this step is pretty quick. All we're going to do into each of these, I'm going to add 400 grams of all-purpose flour. And then 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. I will say if you're using sea salt and table salt, it should be about the same, but this is the Morton's kosher salt. If you're using the diamond crystal, you will need more because that has a lower salinity. I usually do both of these, and then once I'm working with the dough whisk, I'll just switch between the two. And so this step, all I'm trying to do, I'll put this one. I am just getting it incorporated. I'm not worrying about kneading it. As I said earlier, this is a non-knead dough. And you're gonna let it sit for about 15 to 30 minutes. 15 is the minimum, and this is called an Autolyse. Really, it's where you're hydrating the flour, because when you first mix flour and water, flour is very dry, right? That's what keeps it from going moldy. And so, although you've mixed it and it looks like it's come together, that flour isn't actually hydrated yet. It's kind of like when you water really dry plants. You can pour water in, but it just kind of flows through and it's sitting on the surface until after a little while it kind of hydrates more fully. And that's the same thing here. Just getting a mix. I don't want any big clumps of dry because those will be hard to get them mixed in. That's all I'm going for. See how shaggy? It looks so liquidy, but once you start working with it later on, it really does come together. Now this is a rather high hydration dough, but that's also what helps it develop gluten without having to knead it. And gluten is what gives you that good texture. Without gluten, you basically have cake. So without gluten, you kind of have bread that doesn't really have a chew to it, or that just kind of crumbles similar to cake. So the gluten helps to give it a little bit more stretch. So when you're baking it and you're eating it, you kind of have just a better texture, honestly. It's just a more pleasant texture. So all you're trying to do is get these mixed. You're going to allow it to autolyse for, again, 15 to 30 minutes. Usually what I do to make sure, because you don't want to come back sooner, especially for the next steps. 30 minutes is the minimum because you need to let that gluten, what it does is it builds gluten as it's sitting, but then you need to let it rest. And then you come and you work with it again, and it has to rest and build gluten again. If you do it too quickly, it's not building the gluten in between, and you're basically wasting, to an extent, you're wasting your effort and energy. So this one I just have to be careful because this is an old mixer bowl and it has a little hump at the bottom that likes to hide dough. All right, so that's all I have to do. I am done with this. I'll just wash that off. I usually stick it in the dishwasher. And then I'm gonna let these sit. Sometimes I'll cover them. Usually at this point, I'll just cover them either with a regular towel, maybe a damp towel if it's really dry, or I just leave them because there's so much extra water in here that if it dries out a little bit, it's not bad. If I'm putting them in the oven, so let's say it's really cold or I need to do it really quickly, I will cover it then because that dry circulating air in the oven will dry out the surface. But that's it. We're gonna leave these for 30 minutes and then I'll check back and show how I work with the dough from here. So this is from earlier. It's been about 30 minutes and it's a very shaggy dough. I usually actually do this over the sink so I can just dip my hands into the water and not care if it's dripping and making a mess. So all you're trying to do is you want to get under here and you want to lift it up, and you don't want to rip it apart because that breaks the gluten, but by lifting it up and just letting it fall back down in those long strands, it's actually helping to pull the gluten together, and it's creating longer gluten bonds. And those longer gluten bonds are what is going to help create a better texture of dough. And even just in doing this, so this is an example of what it looked like before, and already it's smoothing out, it's coming together. And then all I do each time I work with the dough, just kind of go like this, make sure it's loose and I can pick it up. I flip it over and I kind of fold it in half like this and tuck it partially down. And all I'm trying to do is get it loosely into a shape of a ball, slightly smooth on top. So again, this is what we're looking at now, and this is basically what we started with. So by smoothing it out on top, as it rises, it's pushing against that smooth surface, and even just the act of pushing against that smooth surface is helping it to produce gluten even as it's resting and rising. So working with the dough and stretching it is producing gluten, and that rise process is also producing gluten. So I know I said earlier that I do this 3 times, and I do prefer to do it 3 times, but I've really pushed it, mixed it all at one time, so I didn't do that first process where I mixed in the starter, the water, and a little bit of flour and let it sit, and then added the flour, more flour again later. I mixed it all at once, let it do the Autolyse, and I did this twice, and it still turned out great, but I do think it's better if you can let it go and do the 3 sets of it and let it do that process before. So here again, I'm gonna set a timer for 30 minutes, come back and do that at least once, but preferably 2 more times, okay? Coming in for the next stretch and fold, and just lifting it up, kind of trying to rotate the bowl so I'm doing a new section each time. And I'm just lifting and pulling a little bit, but again, trying to make sure, you all right? That I'm not ripping it apart, so that the gluten that I'm already developing, and I can tell you the texture, it feels thicker. It's not as liquidy. So it's already building gluten each time that it's sitting and resting. So that was similar to how it looked before, and then now I've put it back into that ball shape that I mentioned earlier. So lift, fold, turn, lift, fold, turn, lift, fold, and finally lift, fold. Really, I like to turn and do all 4 sections, or 4 directions. And then do that. And I try to make sure that it's nice and smooth on top. So thank you so much for watching. I'm going to come back in 30 minutes and do this last section again. And please, if you haven't, consider subscribing and liking the video. Last fold, just doing it one more time, about 4 folds. You can see it's already flattened out a good bit. I will say it's pretty cold in here, so it's definitely moving along slowly, but that's perfect since I'm going to be putting it in the fridge for overnight. I don't actually mind, and that's part of the reason why I didn't put it in a warmer location. I could have put it next to our wood stove or next to our stove where we're cooking. All right, so have that one done and this one done. So I am going to cover these with plastic for overnight, because in the fridge that will dry it out a lot and it'll affect the way that it rises. So I don't want that to happen. And since this is the last one, I want to make sure it's nice and smooth. Now we're down to the final step. You'll see that overnight, both of these rose a good bit. They were about here in the bowl, in like a little bowl, and now they're up to about there. So, as I said, each of these will be making 2 different style of bread loaves. One, this is actually an old bakery pan from my parents' bakery. That was my parents' bakery growing up. They did not make sourdough bread, but they did make lots of bread. Or I should say they didn't make a full sourdough. I think they had one, but it had yeast in it. Which, nothing against using yeast in your sourdough. I just enjoy this challenge. It's one less ingredient I have to fiddle with. So all I'm doing is framing this parchment paper. I prefer to bake with parchment paper. I just find it a lot easier to clean up after. And you'll notice this nice and flat. You try to stick it in there and it just bounces back out. If you carefully, if you do it too hard, you will rip holes in it. But if you just ball it up, gently ease it open. Now when you go into it, look at that. So then you're just trying to smooth it back out because you don't want the dough to catch in big chunks of this, so you'll end up baking parchment paper into your bread. I have done that in the past, and although it's not the end of the world, it's definitely not preferred. So I actually really like this shape. This is a really old colander from my grandfather. I like how rounded it is at the bottom. So usually what I do is I put it in here and then I lift this up and put it, once it's risen, put it into the Dutch oven. One day I'll have one of the fancy batons that you can put it in to rise, but I'm just working with what I have now. All right, so I do use flour at this step. If you noticed earlier, all I did was use water for all of the previous steps. This one is a messy step. If the dough is really wet, which it will be because it was in the fridge overnight, sometimes I'll do this first part, go wash off the dough off my hand and then work with the dough, depending on, actually this isn't too bad. If your hands are too sticky, it causes too much of the dough to just keep sticking to your hand. So this one I'm just gonna do the bowl shape. So we're just trying to get it into a nice round shape. I'm not being too gentle, but I'm not trying to rip it either. So remember I mentioned previously about you don't want to rip into the dough. And so here I'm just trying to shape it into a nice round shape using flour, because this edge around the bottom is where it's most likely going to rip. I place that in there, and then all this extra flour that I had for working, I actually use that. I put it around the edge because this is where, if it sticks too much to the parchment paper, it'll affect how well it rises. So there you go. It's not perfect. It's not perfectly smooth. These bubbles will bubble up. When I cut into it before I bake it, I usually try to target those bubbles so that it deflates them. And I don't know, for me it bakes up for exactly what I want. I don't want this to look like perfect store-bought bread. I want it to look good, taste good, and at the end of the day get the job done, which is feed us with something that we enjoy eating, that tastes good, and we made it. So one, we're saving money because I buy my flour in bulk, and even if I didn't, it's still cheaper. A 5-pound bag of flour tends to be cheaper than any good quality loaf of bread I've seen. All right, so this one, I did almost forget, I need to cut. I eyeball it about in half. I'm not cutting into the table. I don't want to cut my table. I just want to cut it enough that I can rip it apart. Smooth down that edge. And then working with one of them at a time. This, I just want to ease into a pretty basic round log. That's what word I'm looking for, log type shape. So sometimes if the ends are really sticking out, I'll kind of tuck them under. but I just kind of put it to bed. So here I'm just lifting and folding. I'll turn, kind of do that again. Oops, there we go. Get a little air bubble sticking out of his butt. And then tuck it under, and that's it. I'm just gonna, again, I'll use this flour to put around those edges. I will say, cleaning the bowl is probably one of the most annoying steps, because up here, where it's been exposed to the air, it can get really rock hard, almost like a really hard glue, if it has a chance to really dry on there. So I'll usually spray it with water, let it sit in the sink for a while and kind of mess around with it for a little bit. And then I have a scraper that I'll use to scrape those parts off. I don't recommend going right in with a rag, because this dough will just gum up on the rag, and that can be really hard to clean. Same thing with the flour. I'll usually try to get as much of the flour off the table. One of the few times I will use paper towel in the kitchen is to get the main remnants of the flour off before I go in with a washcloth. So all I'm gonna do, let these sit for a few hours, a couple hours, not a few. Our house is warming up, so it should just take an hour and a half or 2 hours. I'll usually, it's pretty cool out, but we have a south-facing window that I'll usually put it around those, and that really helps it warm up. I don't put it right in it because that'll almost bake it. But I'll get this going, and then I'll check back in when I put them in the oven. Okay, the last step that I have to do is, I have a razor blade. I don't have one of the fancy tools. As I mentioned, I will go in and kind of try to deflate any of the big bubbles. But basically this is just releasing tension on the surface, because when it goes in, and especially in this Dutch oven where it's going to create steam, it's going to create that release that tension so that it can rise easier. So all you're doing is just creating a couple of cuts. You want to just make sure you're down past the surface. Put it in here. I don't have a lid for my Dutch oven, so I just have a lid that fits it. And then that's it. This Dutch oven is hot. I put it in the oven. It heated up in the 450-degree oven, and then I put the bake. You put it on with the lid on, and you bake it for about 25 to 30 minutes. Take the lid off, and then bake it for another 20 minutes, or until it reaches the level of crispiness or brown color that you're looking for. This one goes in the 425-degree oven for about 35 minutes, and then that's it. Let's see how we're looking. It has been 25 minutes. Looking good. So at this stage, it's cooked, it's cooking, but it hasn't browned yet. So the browning is going to happen once you take the lid off. Let's check this. You see that beautiful caramelly brown color? And as I said, you see how it kind of sticks? If you let it get in there, it'll kind of bake into the parchment paper a little too much. So here I'm going to push that off. This one I took out, it's probably been about 10 minutes. So a little warm. The only thing I like to do is, as soon as I can, I like to get it out from under the parchment paper and someplace where it can cool without the added humidity, the moisture. So fresh bread, as much as you want to cut into it right away, you have to let it sit at least an hour so that it can set up inside. Otherwise, when you cut it, it's going to get gummy. And now for the most rewarding part. So this, as I said, doesn't have a hard crust. You don't want it, or at least I don't want that for more of a sandwich bread. I feel bad cutting into this because we're not going to use it just yet. And it will, the one thing with sourdough is you do not want to really wrap it up tight. You want to let it kind of just be exposed to air. And I can do a separate video on how I refresh my my bread if it's been sitting out for a while. So what I will say is this tunneling that you see here, usually you want that in sourdough. For my sandwich bread, I try to avoid that with the way that I work with it. But because this sat in the cold overnight and did that slow process, it did develop that, which again, most people want in their sourdough. It still has a fairly sweet, just a very kind of that yeasty sandwich bread type flavor. And then we have our Boule. So this one has a much harder crust. I don't know if you can hear that. So before we cut this one, and then this one also has that tunneling, but here we want it. And interestingly, the flavor or the smell is a little bit different. It's a little bit sweeter, but it still has a great texture on the inside. But when you bite into it, the outside has a little bit more of that chewiness that you're really looking for. So what you can do with this, I tend to just cut the whole slices like this and then break it down into smaller pieces. So this knife I got on Amazon and it works incredibly well. But there you go. Beautiful slices, great texture. But thank you so much again for watching all the way to the end, and I hope you have a great day.